a lot of people on the left who would really like to see a more socialist world are looking to China at the moment and wondering if what the Chinese Communist Party are currently offering is a better way forward. China's Communist Party certainly does want to promote this idea of socialism with Chinese characteristics as a better alternative, for China at least, to the kind of neoliberal or market liberal policies that we tend to see in the West. But are they actually Marxist? I'm pretty skeptical about this. In this video, I'll give you one way that they probably are, and one way which I think they definitely aren't. So first, here's how they sort of are. I'm picking up this idea from the historian Rana, who talked about it recently in a podcast. I'll post that in a link below. In Chinese policy documents and party discourse, they tend to use a kind of dialectical language. A dialectic means two opposing social forces contradict with each other and their interaction produces a third outcome. This is something that's really central in Marxist thought to how history moves forward. Actually, the idea of the dialectic came from Hegel, who Marx studied a lot. The central dialectic for Marx, of course, was class struggle. At the time Marx was writing, this struggle meant that between the capitalists, or the bourgeoisie, and the working class, who would, he thought, eventually overthrow them, leading to a communist society. This dialectical way of talking about history is something that we still find in Communist Party language and documents. They talk about the principal contradiction. That principal contradiction has changed over time. During Mao's time, that was class struggle, but after Mao died, under Deng Xiaoping from 1981, it became the ever-growing material and cultural needs of the people versus backward social production. What that really meant was, rather than focusing on class struggle, we need to develop the economy. Particularly, we need to advance the technology on which our economy is based. Then a few decades later, in 2017, Xi Jinping gave a speech in which he announced that the principal contradiction had now changed to become the contradiction between the unbalanced and inadequate development and the people's ever-growing need for a better life. So what we have here is a communist party which is focused on development, using the Hegelian language of dialectics, which is reminiscent of Marxism. But here's how I don't think they're really Marxist. It seems to me you're not really very Marxist if you're not talking about class. Around the mid-1980s, the word class, 阶级, actually dropped out of Chinese official policy discussions. I found this when I was doing my PhD research. I was reading the collective works of various Chinese economists, and I was looking for how they talked about class, and I realized that at a certain point through these collected works, the term class actually just disappeared. The change in language was so stark and so sudden that this didn't seem to be a coincidence. It seemed to be the result of an instruction coming from the top down. So class became something that wasn't really discussed. Instead, the language changed to talk about something called social strata, 社会阶层, but this doesn't have the same kind of political meaning that class has. Scholars writing about China in the years afterwards pointed out that this change had happened just at the point where China was starting to go through a major social transformation. As China was starting to open up to foreign investment and set up lots of factories, particularly in the south and east coasts, millions of migrant workers were beginning to pour in from the countryside to these cities where the factories were to provide low-cost labour for these often foreign-owned businesses. In other words, what you began to see in China was something which looked an awful lot like a proletariat. Actually, this labour force of migrant workers wasn't quite a proletariat in the Marxist sense because they still had land rights back home in their villages. But nevertheless, in essence, this was really a working class made up largely of rural migrant labourers, which eventually numbered into the hundreds of millions. As the scholars Ngai and Chris King Chan pointed out in an article that was published in 2008. This huge migrant workforce did not have the language of class or of class struggle to identify themselves or to politically mobilise around to push for better workers' rights, because this language had actually been taken away. Here's what they said. We see a new Chinese working class struggling to be born at the very moment when the language of class has been silenced. The formation of a new working class in contemporary China has been held in check structurally by these discursive and institutional effects. They argue in their article, and quite convincingly I think, that this discursive move, this removal of the language of class in official Chinese discourse, was a way to deliberately inoculate against potential workers' movements, so that this low cost and very large labour force would be easier for the state to control and manage in the interests of capital and foreign businesses. The language of class struggle is still very difficult to use in China, at least in any official capacity. So, since class is really a concept that's very central to Marxist politics, I find it very difficult to understand the Chinese Communist Party at the moment as really Marxist. Thank you for watching.